We're now going to have a short tribute to poet and friend Peter Culley, who would have been here this weekend but suddenly passed away last week. And to hold the tribute, please welcome Kim Goldberg.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. One of the first people I met and one of the first friends I made when I moved to Nanaimo in the late 1970s was, in fact, Peter Culley. He was 18 years old and I was 22, and we each worked, we had a job at the Nanaimo Museum in the darkroom restoring archival photos of the city. Hundreds and hundreds of photos that were torn, yellowed, sepia-toned, ripped, creased, stained, that people had been saving and would bring into the museum in shoe boxes and photo albums that they had squirreled away in dusty closets and attics for years. They brought them in, we reshot them so that we could get a new negative of these old images, and then in the dark room, using archival processing, we made a good quality black and white print of each of these and filed them. So even as a teenager, Peter had this abiding interest and commitment to photography and to local history and to working class culture. And he understood, even then, in such early years, he understood the importance of doing everything possible to preserve this material and to preserve this part of our existence and our culture, not let it slip away completely in the wash of artificiality and shopping malls and plastic that is otherwise engulfing us then as well as now. So he understood this even at age 18. He was also a poet even then. 3 years later, when he was 21 years old, he published his first volume of poetry that was titled, not surprisingly, 21. That was published by Oolican Books. Peter is known to people as many things, not just a poet. He's certainly known as a photographer as well as an art critic and writer about art. People who know Peter primarily from Facebook or from his blog will actually perhaps not even realize he's a poet. They'll think he's a photographer because that's almost entirely what he would publish and post to Facebook and his blog, images with no text whatsoever. I, however, knew Peter primarily as a poet, and Peter is included, of course, he's probably most well known as a poet for his Hammertown trilogy of books, all of which have been published by New Star Books. Pete is also in the anthology that we're going to be launching tonight, Make It True, the anthology of 89 poets from the Cascadian bioregion, and Pete was slated to read tonight before his very untimely death just 3 weeks ago at the age of 56. There's been such an outpouring on social media of memories about Peter and recollections of him that it seemed very important to us here at the festival that we reserve some time right at the beginning of this evening to really acknowledge his presence. He's still with us after all. He's in the anthology that we're going to be launching tonight, so he's very much here in the room. And so we wanted to have some means to really formally remember him here before we launch the anthology. We're going to have 3 people who knew him, who were friends of his, each say a few words either about Peter or a few words of Peter's in the form of his poetry. We'll be hearing from Rolf Maurer, Renee Sacklickar, and George Stanley. First up will be Pete's longtime friend and publisher, Rolf Maurer of New Star Books.
Good evening. It is both an honor and distressing to be here, but we are here. I'd like to acknowledge quickly Pete's wife and life partner, Daphne, who's here tonight, and also his daughter-in-law, Kathy. They're in the front row. Music is not about self-expression. Self-expression is boring and hideous and pretty much pointless and really the bane of the 20th century. Art is not about self-expression. Art is about social expression, a communal intercourse. The purpose of art is to upbuild the community. The intent is the sharing of hopes and dreams and fears. Whether that accomplishes something by the fact of it is another question, but that's not the intent. The speaker of those lines is a musician, David Thomas, which explains the lumpy syntax at times, but there is a clear thought that shines through, and I do thank Alex Vardy of the Georgia Strait for noticing that and writing down what David Thomas said back in 1993. David Thomas was the leader of a band called Père Ubu, and interestingly, in 1989, Père Ubu released an album called Cloudland. And Cloudland was the name that Peter had given a long poem that finishes the book 21 10 years previously. The poem, incidentally, is dedicated to George Stanley, and the last section of the poem is dedicated to Daphne Samuel. And like a lot of people here, because I get Facebook on my computer too, I know that when a lot of people heard this news, they reached for a Peter Culley book and read it, and a lot of people posted passages that resonated with him. And the one that jumped out at me was a passage in this book 21. It was right towards the end of it. It jumped out at me for a number of reasons. One of it is because for those of you who are somewhat familiar with this very scarce book, it has a very different tone from Peter's later work. And a lot of people, there's a kind of a myth that's developed that Peter disowned that book somehow, and that's not quite the truth. What really happened is, more or less as that book was going to the printer, he had reached a kind of a crossroads in his own artistic practice, and he had become a very different kind of a poet. Specifically, what he had moved away from was what I think of as the private eye, the first-person eye of his earlier poetry, and adopted what would become the dominant position of all of his later work, which I have come to call the camera eye, although it's important to notice that it also included other senses, including taste, smell, sound. The other reason, however, that this piece jumped out at me was because of a conversation that Peter and I had been having, one of the threads over the many years that we've been talking, which was about editing. And we had some differing ideas about that. Now, I'm not talking about this specific line editing, but what I have just in the last few weeks developed the term brutalist editing, where you take whole pieces of work, more or less intact, and move them around. Or cropping would be an example of that. Peter was a photographer, was not at ease with cropping. He was critical when I did it, and he thought that there was something kind of weak about it, and he didn't see it as part of his own practice. And so I thought that when I saw this passage at the end of this longer poem called Cloudland, I wanted to ask him what he would make of what occurred to me, because what happened when you took, not the whole, but most of this poem, cut off basically about the last 14 lines, right in the middle of the line, and transposed it into a different context 35 years later, you end up with Peter, I think, writing a very different poem than he thought he was writing back in 1979, this would have been. I awoke, my hand on the cat's pregnant belly, gray light falling through a house filled with warm creatures, and blessed as I am with their discriminate love, I smoke the last cigarette, stare disconsolately out from the edge of the bed through stained glass at the sky, at the blue and red clouds full of rain. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Rolf. Next up is Pete's friend and poetry colleague, Renee Sacklikar. Renee?
Facebook, July 13th, 2013. Skytrain to Surrey. This morning, on the way to South Bank Writers Program, platform reading, Columbia to Surrey City Centre. Peter Culley's Briggs and Stratton in my hand. Conversation. Are you really reading a book about lawnmower engines? A pleasant man talks to me with entheos about machines. Turns out he is an award-winning BCIT instructor. Mama Roo. At the corner store, the Protestant Santeria of the lottery logos, fake foxing against a gold rush font, the leprechaun's derby overflows. A yellow cord marks off the liquor store after 11. Outside, courtesy of the smoke from Burns Bog, the moon trails a gambler's beard. A kettle of coins rattles inside the aqua tunnel under Highway 1, illuminates the figure 8 I inscribed on a whim on the slope outside the Cranberry Fire Hall. Or it could be the pimp juice sticker the PepsiCo rep slapped near the entrance, or the ice cube with wings and a Grecian profile, loyal to the old regime, where the word cold came wreathed in beads of sweat, and every word unashamedly itself, like those farmers in Emerson who planted themselves last, pulling the earth over themselves like an old quilt. It's for Daphne.
Thank you, Renee.
Thank you for that, Renee. And we'll conclude our tribute to Peter Culley by hearing from Pete's longtime friend, colleague, and one of the 4 editors on the anthology we're celebrating tonight, George Stanley.
Thank you, Kim. It was very sad news to hear that Peter had died a couple of weeks ago. I have admired and been astonished at times by his poetry since I first met him when he and his friend Kevin Davies arrived in I often say San Francisco instead of Vancouver, in Vancouver in the late 1970s. Peter was, I would say, a difficult poet. I wouldn't say he was obscure, but difficult because of the tremendous range of his reference. It runs from botany to jazz to aviation to geology and back. And not only that, but that his poetry is not in any way paraphrasable. I think it's true what Rolf Maurer just said, that it is a form of social expression, so that one feels in the poem that the society itself is attempting to speak in contradictory voices. I'm going to read, he dedicated a poem to me, a long poem, The Inland Empire. It's in 7 parts. I'm going to read the first part of part 1 and then all of part 2. And in this first part, we remember not only Peter, but also another poet whom we lost a couple of years back, and that is Billy Little, whose nom de plume was Zonko. So I have to imitate Billy Little's voice. The weak solder of solidarity, Zonko's "Hang the Socreds" in his best Queens in Victoria, under the gaze of Victoria, who looks like a young Mary Todd. I tried to find who Peter was referring to by Mary Todd. There is a Canadian historical novelist living in Toronto who happens to have graduated from Queen's University, so there is a connection here between Billy Little coming from Queens, New York, and Victoria, and Mary Todd. Or a bomb-wielding Avignon Pope under the gaze of the rank and file who can't wait for Jack Monroe to come out of the snow to get them off the hook and back to Nanaimo. And then this is in italics. When the poets start, it's time to leave. This is part 2. This snowball smells like fish. And down the same railroad cut, which carries the ascending whine and keening rumble of traffic sometimes, bacon, smokes, coffee, acetone, pig shit, cow shit, frying chicken, if less of the burger onion startup combo casserole than years since, weed, the horse farm goat, always the greenwood smoke at the bottom of the bowl. Yellowed penguin pages, ordinary leaves of Don Allen, failing transmissions from off-island, subject to frequency modulation and infant theft, the last ethered sunlight of grade 11, a slice of lemon pound cake from which the rind had been removed, Morse code from a coffin. Idea of North, Protestant North, no California lemons, bare-knuckle bonhomie, pubs heated by sweat and breath and pickled egg farts, terry cloth tonsure, cards till daybreak, a winter without hugs or drugs, hockey fights and hockey kisses, the rolling gray scale of a cheap TV into which the test pattern has been burned, conditional recognition, not so much as a poet as one marked off as that injured aldermanic raven walking bent through the snow and toward the fence with an entitled eye to the point of death. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George, and thank you, Kim. And so we dedicate the launch of the book tonight to Peter.